Have you ever seen a quote, maybe from an old text or even just something you read online, and you just get that feeling that you're missing something, like you're not getting the whole picture?
Yeah, like the words are there, but the real punch, the why behind them is just out of reach.
Exactly. And then worse, you see that same quote maybe used completely out of context, maybe to justify something that feels, well, just wrong.
It happens all the time.
It really does.
Yeah.
And knowing that why that context isn't just academic, is it? It feels more like having the key to unlock what was really meant.
Absolutely. Without it, you're often just guessing.
And those guesses, those misinterpretations, they can have really serious consequences. That's the challenge and, honestly, the fascinating opportunity we're diving into today.
Okay.
Our mission here is to explore a really vital concept for understanding the Holy Qur'an, Asbāb Al-Nuzūl.
Which literally means the occasions or reasons for revelation.
Right. And this isn't just for, high-level scholars. We think it's a powerful shortcut for anyone to be truly well-informed, to grasp why certain passages were revealed when they were.
And crucially, how knowing that helps avoid serious misapplication.
Exactly.
It's so important because, well, when we talk about the Quran, we're talking about the absolute heart and soul of Islam. It's the ultimate authority.
The uncontested authority.
Yes, often called the criterion of right and wrong. Our sources are really clear on this. Everything that is Islamic has its origin in or takes inspiration from the Quran.
Wow. Everything.
Pretty much. So understanding how it was revealed piece by piece and why specific verses came down at particular moments, well, it's fundamental.
Because without that specific context.
Verses can be pulled out, quoted completely out of context, and sadly, sometimes misapplied to justify actions that are, well, violent, inhuman even.
Which is the opposite of the intended message, presumably.
Precisely. So this deep dive isn't about trying to reinterpret the sacred text itself. It's about getting a really informed, accurate understanding of its foundational sources.
Okay, so let's get specific then. Asbāb Al-Nuzūl. What are we actually talking about here? What kind of events or questions are we looking at?
We're talking about the specific incidents, the actual events, sometimes even direct questions people asked that prompted the revelation of particular Quranic verses or sometimes whole chapters.
So like the immediate historical backdrop.
Exactly. You have to remember the Quran wasn't revealed, as one big book dropped from the sky.
Right, it came down over time.
Over nearly 23 years, piece by piece, often directly responding to things that were happening, events, questions, specific situations facing the Prophet Muhammad and the early Muslim community.
And why does knowing that matter so much today? You might think, okay, that was then, this is now.
Yeah.
How does ancient history help understand a timeless scripture?
Well, the source material we looked at really emphasizes this. It says, knowing the history of the Qur'an's interpretation, coupled with an understanding of contemporary social and political issues, contribute to a better informed understanding.
Ah, so it's about connecting the past context to present understanding.
Exactly. And it's precisely to combat that danger we mentioned versus being quoted out of context and misapplied for harmful purposes.
It's not about changing the text, but understanding its original force and intent.
Precisely. Think of it like a legal ruling. Knowing the specific case, the arguments presented, the judge's reasoning, it all helps clarify the true scope and intent of the final judgment.
That's a great analogy. Let's bring this home with an example. Our sources mention a really interesting incident with Marwan ibn al-Hakam and a specific verse 3.187.
Ah, yes, Marwan. He was governor of Medina for a time.
Right. And he read this verse, "Think not that those who exult in what they have given," and he started to worry.
He thought it might apply to anyone who felt pleased or happy about doing a good deed.
Exactly. Which, if you think about it, would make feeling good about positive actions problematic.
A very challenging interpretation, yes.
But then Ibn Abbas, who was a very respected companion of the Prophet,
And known for his deep knowledge of the Quran.
he stepped in and clarified. He basically told Marwan, hold on, you're taking this out of context. He explained that this verse wasn't a general statement about feeling good about your deeds. It was specifically revealed about a particular group of Jews at the time.
Right, who had apparently concealed some important information the Prophet had asked for, but still acted as if they deserved praise.
So a very specific situation of hypocrisy, not a general condemnation of satisfaction in good works.
Exactly. And without knowing that specific occasion of revelation, Marwan was applying the verse far too broadly.
So that context acts like a focusing lens, doesn't it?
Perfectly put. Without the lens, the verse seems general, maybe even confusing. With the lens, you see the precise target, the intended meaning.
And this study, Asbāb Al-Nuzūl, it's just one part, right? One branch of the broader sciences of the Quran.
That's right. It fits alongside other important studies, like figuring which verses were revealed early in Mecca versus later in Medina, or how the Quran was meticulously collected and arranged into the book we have today.
But Asbāb Al-Nuzūl feels like a really crucial piece for interpretation.
It absolutely is a very important piece of that larger puzzle.
Okay, talking about critical pieces, we absolutely have to mention Ali ibn Ahmad al-Wāḥidī.
Al-Wāḥidī, a towering figure. He passed away back in 1075 CE, so over 900 years ago.
And his book, also called Asbāb Al-Nuzūl, is described as the earliest extant and best-known representative work of this genre. Basically, the first big one that survived.
And he wasn't just focused on this one area. Our sources describe him as a real polymath, a poet, a philologist.
Someone who studies language and texts.
Exactly, a grammarian and a Quranic commentator, apparently hailed in his time as the greatest commentator of the Quran.
So a heavyweight. His work really laid the foundation for this whole field.
It did. And his motivation, his driving force, was this deep conviction. He believed it is not possible to know the interpretation of a given verse or the meaning it alludes to without knowing its story and the occasion of its revelation.
For him, it was indispensable. You had to know the story.
That context was everything for unlocking the meaning.
Now, what's really interesting and maybe a bit complex is that Al-Wāḥidī's idea of what counts as an occasion of revelation, a Asbāb Nuzūl, seems to have been much broader than how later scholars defined it.
Yes, that's a key point. He included quite a range of material.
What kind of things did he include that maybe wouldn't fit a stricter definition?
Well, the sources give examples. He included things like the story of demons associated with Prophet Solomon, found in Surah Al-Baqarah,
Okay.
or stories about the sacking of Jerusalem centuries before Islam, even the story of Prophet Abraham asking God how he revives the dead, or the story of Adam and Eve from Surah Al-Araf.
So these sound more like background narratives or maybe illustrations of themes within the chapters rather than a specific event triggering the verse's revelation right then and there.
That's how some later scholars viewed it, yes. His approach was incredibly comprehensive, almost encyclopedic in a way.
But it meant his definition of occasion might also encompass broader themes of the surahs and verses, not just the immediate trigger.
Exactly. And understanding that broad scope is important when we look at how his work was received and sometimes critique later on.
Right, because like any groundbreaking work, especially one from so long ago, it wasn't immune to scrutiny, was it?
No, definitely not. And this is where the scholarly discussion gets really interesting. His work was pioneering, foundational even, but later scholars did raise some significant questions.
It shows the field evolving, refining its methods.
Precisely. Later generations built upon his work, but also applied new standards of verification, particularly from the field of hadith studies.
Okay, so what were some of the main criticisms leveled at Al-Wāḥidī's methodology?
Well, several points come up in our sources. First, the scope, as we touched on. His book covers maybe about 570 verses.
Which sounds like a lot, but out of over 6,600 verses in the Quran.
It's actually a fairly small percentage, so it wasn't, and perhaps never claimed to be, a comprehensive record for every verse.
Okay, what else?
Authentication was a big one. Some of the occasions he reported were considered not well authenticated.
Meaning their historical reliability was shaky.
Or at least questioned by later standards of source criticism.
Right.
Also, sometimes an occasion was cited in connection with more than one incident, which creates obvious confusion.
Yeah, which event was it actually linked to?
Right, and some accounts were even reported as self-contradictory.
Not ideal for clarity.
Definitely not. Another point was his method of citation. Sometimes he'd apparently cite narrations without any chain of transmission at all.
Just the story, without saying who passed it down from whom.
Kind of. Or based on what seems like pure guesswork in some instances. And he'd use phrases like the commentators of the Qur'an said.
Which sounds authoritative, but...
It could just mean a general scholarly opinion he picked up rather than a directly transmitted, verifiable report tracing back to the time of revelation.
Ah, okay. So it sounds like, while groundbreaking, there were methodological weaknesses, especially regarding source verification, compared to later standards.
That's a fair assessment based on the criticisms, and the sources point out he was never recognized as a scholar of hadith.
Hadith being the sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, a crucial source for context.
Exactly. And this alleged lack of expertise is clearly manifest, according to some critics. They point to him narrating from individuals who were later accused of being liars or generally unreliable.
Wow, okay. That's pretty serious criticism.
It is, and there were even instances where his accounts seemed to contradict known historical facts.
So given these criticisms, how did later scholars view the whole genre of Asbāb Al-Nuzūl? Did they dismiss it or find a way forward?
There was definitely debate, a scholarly contention, as the source puts it. Some perhaps overemphasized it, maybe implying every single verse must have a specific identifiable occasion.
Which might not be realistic.
Right. Others tended to downplay its importance, but many sought a more balanced approach.
Like who? Are there key figures who offered a different perspective?
Yes. Shah Waliullah al-Alawi, an influential 18th century scholar from India, offered a really useful distinction.
Okay.
He proposed two kinds of occasions. First, those that are genuinely required for the understanding of verses linked to specific historical events. Think battles, treaties, specific disputes. Knowing the event is crucial there.
Makes sense.
But then, he said, there are verses that are clearly meant to be of general applicability. In these cases, the reported occasion isn't meant to limit the verse's meaning only to that one past event.
The occasion is more like an example.
Exactly. An illustration of how the general principle applies, but not the sole reason or a restriction on its broader relevance.
That sounds like a very practical distinction.
It is. And then in the 20th century, you had scholars like Hamid al-Din al-Farahi and Amin Ahsan Islahi.
What was their take?
They championed what's known as the coherence theory, or Nazm al-Quran. Their view was that the Qur'an is inherently coherent and largely self-explanatory.
Meaning you can understand it well just by looking at the text itself, its structure, the flow between verses and chapters.
That was their emphasis. They felt that focusing too heavily on isolated external occasions could actually hinder appreciation of this internal coherence. They worried it could make a surah look like a completely disjointed discourse.
Just a collection of responses to random events rather than a unified message.
That was their concern, yes. It really shows the ongoing, lively intellectual engagement with how best to approach the text.
Absolutely. So considering Al-Wāḥidī's pioneering work and these later critiques and alternative views, where does that leave us? What's a lasting value of his Asbāb Al-Nuzūl?
Well, despite all the valid critiques, the consensus seems to be that Al-Wāḥidī's work remains an invaluable piece of scholarship.
Why is that, given the methodological issues?
Because context matters. It was the first extant attempt to collect all the material regarding the occasions of revelation in one single volume. He literally created the genre as we know it.
He set the stage.
He did. And his work, for all its flaws by later standards, has stood the test of time as the foundational reference point. Later works refined the method, but they built on his foundation.
Okay, so it's historically significant, the starting point. And to get a more refined view on how it's useful today, our sources mention Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur.
Yes, a major 20th century Tunisian scholar known for his monumental Qur'an commentary. He offered what the source calls an objective and balanced summary evaluation of the value of knowing the occasions.
And what did he conclude? When is knowing the occasion truly vital?
Ibn Ashur laid out several specific scenarios. He said occasions are valuable for elaboration on and explanation of Quranic verses which require it.
When the verse itself is concise or maybe a bit ambiguous on its own?
Precisely. They can clarify points of detail which are not readily clear. Sometimes, knowing the occasion functions as a sufficient commentary all by itself. The story tells you what you need to know.
Okay.
It can also direct the commentator to seek scriptural proofs or alert them to stylistic peculiarities like why a certain word or phrase is used, which might only make sense given the specific context.
That makes a lot of sense. Do we have examples that illustrate Ibn Ashur's point about usefulness?
Yes, the sources give a couple of really good ones he likely would have appreciated. Remember verse 5.44, "Whoso judgeth not by that which Allah hath revealed, such are disbelievers."
Right. Sounds very general and quite stern.
Extremely. But if you know the context, that it was revealed specifically concerning Christians of that time who were not judging by their own revealed scripture, the gospel, then the word whoso isn't just any whoever. It functions more like a definite pronoun referring back to that specific group in that specific instance.
That completely changes the scope, doesn't it? From a universal condemnation to a specific critique.
Profoundly. Or take verse 6.82. Those who believe and obscure not their belief by wrongdoing, zulm.
We mentioned this one earlier. The companions are confused.
There were. They asked the prophet, who among us doesn't commit some wrongdoing? It seemed impossibly strict.
Understandably.
But the prophet himself, providing the immediate context and clarification, explained that zulm here specifically meant shirk associating partners with God. He even referenced another verse, 31.3 has, which calls shirk a tremendous wrong, zulmun azim.
So the prophet's own explanation, tied to the moment of confusion, is the crucial context.
Exactly. Without knowing that specific clarification from the prophet, part of the occasion, you could easily misunderstand the verse's intended meaning.
So if we try to connect this all to the bigger picture, what's the main takeaway from Ibn Ashir's balanced view?
I think his concluding point is incredibly important. He stressed that the Qur'an was revealed primarily as universal discourses, meant for guidance and legislation for all time.
So the big picture message is key.
Absolutely. Therefore, he argued, these universal messages should not entirely be confined to partial, particular scenarios, because doing so would basically annul what is intended by them. You'd lose the universal guidance.
Nice balance, right?
Yes, that's the crucial balance. He also stressed that passages of the Qur'an which are certain to be of particular applicability should not be generalized.
Like the verse about Marwan, or the one about the Christians. You shouldn't take those specific critiques and apply them wrongly to everyone.
Exactly. So it's about understanding this interplay, respecting the universal principles, while also recognizing when a verse was addressing a very specific situation. Grasping that balance, Ibn Ashur believed, is key to understanding God's intent in his revelation.
That's a really powerful framework, not limiting the universal, but not overgeneralizing the particular.
Precisely.
Well, that brings our deep dive into Asbāb Al-Nuzūl towards its close. We've journeyed from the basic idea of context to the pioneering work of Al-Wāḥidī through scholarly critiques and towards a balanced understanding of its value. And it seems clear that understanding the why and when behind these revelations isn't just an academic exercise. It really is a powerful tool.
It helps appreciate the incredible depth and precision of the Qur'an.
And guards against misapplication, enriching our grasp of messages that are meant to be timeless by understanding their timely origins. It gets us closer to the intended meaning.
It really does. And maybe it leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
Oh.
This whole discussion about context, about universal versus particular applicability, how much does that apply beyond religious texts?
You mean to other things we encounter?
Yeah. Think about historical documents, legal rulings, even news reports or social media posts today. How often do we encounter information stripped of its original context?
All the time.
So what responsibility do we have as people trying to learn and understand the world to actively seek out that original context before we form strong conclusions? Or worse, before we use snippets of information to justify our own views or actions?
That's a really powerful question. It suggests that being truly informed, maybe even wise, requires that extra step digging beyond the surface, asking, what's the story here? What was the occasion? It's a challenge for all of us, isn't it?
It certainly is a crucial one, I think.